If you have a Bible and you find it helpful to follow along, please turn it to the 22nd chapter of Luke, Luke 22. This is where we'll be spending our time today. There's a lot going on in this passage, and one of the things that this passage has, and it'll continue into next week as well, is that there's a Jewish holiday, the Passover. What's significant here is that this is one of those places in the Scripture where the resurrection of Jesus is made historically more firm. That is, we think about the resurrection, we're coming toward Resurrection Day in our lives, in our church calendar, and we think about the resurrection in terms of you either believe it or you don't. It's a fact of faith. Well, it's more than a fact of faith. And this is one of those texts that gives us an historical shift that you cannot explain apart from Jesus rising from the dead. In Judaism, you got to remember, Judaism at this point in history is 1700 years old at the time of Jesus. All that time they've been practicing with a certain thing in mind from the 15th century BC when Moses led them out of Egypt. They have practiced this ritual, and this ritual is going to change in a most dramatic way. We'll get to that next week. But as this text goes, let's take a look at it. I'll begin reading in verse 1 of Luke chapter 22. The feast of unleavened bread, which is called the Passover, was approaching. And the chief priests and the experts of the law were trying to find some way to arrest Jesus and have him executed, but they were afraid of the people. Then Satan entered into Judas, the one who is called Iscariot, who was one of the 12. And Judas went away and discussed with the chief priests and the officers of the temple guard how he might betray Jesus and hand Jesus over to them. They were happy about that and arranged to give Judas money. So Judas agreed and began looking for an opportunity to betray Jesus when there was no crowd present. Now, this text, as it stands, tells us some stuff about Judaism that's really important. And the history here is important because it's going to be so dramatically changed by the fact of what the Christians, those converted Jews, those completed Jews, are going to believe after they see Jesus alive. Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Jesus has come to this Passover, and this is what tells me Jesus probably came to Jerusalem a lot. Some scholarships wants to say that Jesus was only in Jerusalem a few times, but he was in Jerusalem a lot. Even though most of his ministry took place in the northern part of Judea around Galilee, he was in Jerusalem because Jesus was a faithful Jewish man. And so he's going to obey all of these moments when he's supposed to be at the temple for some kind of feast. He's going to obey those things. But he's come to this Passover to die. And he knows it. The Jews will eat unleavened bread to commemorate the fact that when they left Egypt, they didn't have time. I don't know how much you know about this kind of leavening of bread, but what you did was you made your dough, and then you set a little clump of it aside to ferment, to, in a sense, rot, in a certain sense, such that the yeast and the various bacteria that make bread do what it does in the oven would be there for the next lump of dough, the next day. So you'd take that little lump of leaven each day and you'd put it in your new dough. They made bread every day in this time of history. Bread was a staple of your diet. It was made fresh every day. Well, they would eat unleavened bread to commemorate the fact that they had to run away from their homes so quickly that they didn't have time to make the leavened dough. And so they carried with them as they traveled away from Egypt unleavened bread. So this is the celebration of that. The Passover, you know what that's about. That's where they were told by God on the night before the angel of death was going to be sent, put that the lamb of the blood, lamb's blood over your lintel. And if you'll do that, the angel of death will pass over your house. And so every firstborn in every household, whether it was an animal or a person, died that night when the angel of death came if the angel did not see that blood over the lintel. So this is the Passover feast. It was a week long, and they did a lot of stuff in Jerusalem to get ready for it. They would go out and clean the streets. They would go out, and if there were holes, potholes, they would repair them. They did everything they could to make all of the people who would make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem for this festival and make it easy for them. They would whitewash all the tombs freshly. Why? Well, because if you're Jewish, you're not supposed to touch a tomb. If you do, you're unclean. And you don't want to be unclean on Passover. So they would whitewash them so that you would see them. Don't touch this. It's whitewashed tomb. The story of Passover would be told for a month in every home and in every synagogue and at the temple. Over and over and over and over. Now, that says something to me. You go back to Deuteronomy chapter 8 and you read where Moses commanded the Jews to recite these things to their children every day. We live in a culture where we've got access to information such that we don't do this. One of the aspects of church life, congregational life, you hear people say, well, I'm not going to go, I'm not getting anything out of it. And part of that statement comes from the repetition. I mean, we got one Bible, right? 66 books, it's the same Bible, we use it year in and year out. There are only so many things that can be said. There's some repetition, but repetition is good. We need it. We need to have these things repeated to us. I do, on and on and on, so that we don't forget. When you talk to somebody who's been away from their life as a practicing believer for a long time, a lot of this stuff doesn't have the significance it has if you're hearing about it at least once a week. So 2 days before Passover, every Jewish household, they would take a lamp and light it, and they would search every corner of the house to make sure that they had gotten all the leavened dough out of the house. No leavening in the house anywhere. It was a ceremonial thing. It wasn't that they were really actually looking for the leaven, but it was a way of saying, we're going to get rid of all the leaven and we're going to tie ourselves back to that leaving of Egypt as a celebration of it. Every Jew was obligated to this feast. If you were a male Jew, you had to be at the temple if you lived within 15 miles of Jerusalem. Just had to. That's just the way it is. And every Jew from all over the wide world would try to, at least once in their life, come to the Passover in Jerusalem. As a matter of fact, Orthodox Jews to this day, scattered all over the world, pray that God will allow them one time to go to Jerusalem to have the Passover feast. The Romans made preparations too. This is in the Roman Empire. The Romans knew that there were going to be a lot of people in Jerusalem who would normally not be there. And the Jews had a reputation with the Romans, and that is they're troublesome. They're really troublesome. If something happens that upsets the Jews in a religious sense, they make trouble. So the Romans, what they would do is they would send lots of troops to Jerusalem during the Passover feast, because that's the biggest festival there is. And so they would send troops there. Now you may say, well, what are the numbers like? Well, here's how it works. We know from Roman records that 250,000 lambs were sacrificed in Jerusalem on Passover. If you're going to have a Passover Seder, a festival, a meal, you have to have at least 10 Jews there to do it. 250,000 times 10 is 2.5 million. And that's the minimum. So heaven only knows. There were millions of people in Jerusalem for these Passover feasts. So the Romans looked at that and said, we're going to send a lot of troops because we don't want any trouble. This is why this is so significant with Judas. Because the Jewish officials, here's our chance. Jesus is right here. He's in Jerusalem. We've got him. How are we going to go get him without upsetting these gigantic crowds of people? Because the Jewish people, the common people, loved Jesus. They loved to hear him teach. They wanted him to continue to be a rabbi. So how are we going to arrest him without upsetting everybody? And why is that significant? Because there are a lot of Roman soldiers there, and if you start a riot, there was a lot that the Romans would overlook. They overlooked the Jewish practice in their religion. They did not make Jewish men serve in the military because it was against Jewish religious practice. You could not be part of a pagan army. They let the Jews use only Jewish coinage in the temple because there were pagan images on the coins. Caesar's name is there. Caesar's face is there. You couldn't use things like that in the Jewish. They overlooked all of this religious practice, and I'm going to say the Romans were really accommodating to the Jews. They really were. But one thing they would not put up with was a riot. If there was civil unrest, they were coming, and they were going to be swinging those scabbards, and they were going to be whacking at people with them, and they were going to make sure the riots did not happen. They had zero tolerance for civic unrest, period, in the Roman Empire. So, the Jewish officials who are trying to arrest Jesus have a problem. How do we do this quietly? The text is so stark there, isn't it? It just says, then Satan entered into Judas. There's your answer. That's going to solve the problems for the Jewish guard, the temple guard. How do we arrest Jesus? We're going to get into the 12. We're going to infiltrate the 12, and one of them is going to be the means by which we catch Jesus out and arrest him away from the crowds. Because the 12 are going to be with Jesus all the time. Different times of the day, it's not going to matter. You remember when Jesus went to the wilderness to be tempted, when the text closes regarding the temptation, it says, and Satan left him for a more opportune time. Well, that more opportune time has come. It's come. Now, I'm going to say Jesus had tremendous compassion for Judas. He's one of the 12, right? He's not just some person. Jesus didn't find a person who was evil to betray him. That's not how it worked. Judas is one of the 12, and I know this because of the Last Supper and the way in which it worked. First of all, Jesus doesn't turn Judas into the other 12. He could have. I would imagine there'd be a fist fight if that had happened. Judas is going to betray me. I want you guys to know he's going to turn me over to the Jewish. But those other 11 would have had it, Judas. Sure enough. But they didn't, because Jesus never ratted him out. Jesus, when they're sitting at the Last Supper, Judas is on his left and John's on his right. Those were the two places of honor at the table next to the rabbi. Remember when James and John, they sent their mom, Salome, to Jesus and said, Salome comes to Jesus and says, Lord, is there a way that you could have James and John sit on your right and your left when you come into the kingdom? Those are places of honor. And so there's Judas right there. He's at the place of honor at the table. That's a sign of friendship. That's not Judas being picked out to be the evil guy. It's almost like Jesus, there's no question he loved Judas. And there's no question that he is, I think, extending to Judas in every way the chance to say, Judas, you know you don't want to do this. That's the way it looks to me. So then that raises some questions for me. Is God in control of these events? Yes, he is. All of this had to happen in a certain way, or there would be a riot and things would not go the way they were going to go. If the Jewish officials openly arrest Jesus in the daytime, there's going to be trouble. The Romans are coming in. You'd have hundreds of Jews killed. Who knows what would have happened? And Jesus might have just gotten away. But the fact that Judas, it says the text, it solves the problem in the text by saying Satan entered into Judas. He didn't come into Judas without Judas's permission. That is really significant to remember. And it tells me something about us. It tells me two things. One, I'm a fallen human being and I can be an instrument of Satan too. I can. Any of us can. And it tells me also that God enters into me and you only by permission as well. There's no we kind of talked about it a little bit in Sunday school today. There's no neutral ground in the world. There is no neutral ground between God and his enemy. Jesus said it. I didn't say it. Jesus said, if you're not with me, you're against me. Plain and simple. Matthew chapter 12. If you're not with me, you're against me. And this is one of the places where the gospel becomes so offensive to our culture. in that, how can you say something like that? How can you say that Jesus is so exclusive? I thought God loved everybody. How can, if I'm not with Jesus, I'm against Jesus? Well, Rip didn't say it. We're just repeating what we've been told. We live in a culture right now. I don't know if you've heard this. You probably have. If you're reading the news or you're listening to the news, we live in what's called the culture of cancellation. You ever heard of that? The canceling culture? If you or I adopt an attitude about the world that the culture disagrees with, they'll ruin your reputation if they can get a crack at it. They'll do something, say something, post something on the internet about you or me or somebody if they can find a way to ruin you and me in the eyes of the culture. Well, if you say that Jesus is the only way, nobody agrees with that except people who believe. Do you think it? I'll just say it this way, and this is, I think, absolutely the case. This kind of idea of what's called the ethic of radical inclusion is what we live in today, where we want to be so inclusive of everybody. Don't care what you do, what you believe, what kind of ethic you have. We want to be inclusive of everything except one thing, and that is that you're a follower of Jesus. That's the one place where you can't be inclusive, because Jesus isn't inclusive. He says, I'm the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. All right, that cancels everybody else out. And so the culture is going to look at that and say to you and to me, and it's not happening yet, but it's happening in places. It's already happening, and it's going to happen more, that you're canceled out. We're going to make sure that you can't get a job, or that you're listed on some kind of terrible list of people that we want to make sure we don't have anything to do with. It's no accident that we live in that culture right now. That is not an accident at all. God is so merciful. You know, He steers us through life. He was steering Judas through life. But God, in His knowledge, knew that Judas was going to come to a place where he was going to say no to Jesus. Maybe Judas thought he was doing a good thing. Maybe Judas thought Jesus was crazy. I don't know. But as God steers us and gives us opportunities, He steered Judas, and Judas had all his opportunities just like the other 12. Think of it. He was with Jesus for 3 years. He ate with Him, saw Him teach, saw Him heal, saw all the miracles, just like the other 11. And yet he chose to turn Jesus in this way. What does that tell me? It tells me that no matter how much information a person has about the gospel, there is still a choice that has to be made, no matter what. And there's plenty of information. The Bible says, I didn't say it, the Bible says that every human being on the planet has sufficient information about God to be saved. Everybody. You, me, the person way off out there in the bush who's, wearing a leopard skin hat and worshiping a tree stump. They still have enough information about God that they can be saved. So nobody has an excuse. Judas was no exception to that. He had plenty of information, and yet he made a different choice. So was Judas eventually saved? Well, in my heart, I would like to say he was. But the text doesn't tell me that. I'm not going to know this side of heaven. The circumstances tell me otherwise. Could God save Judas? Yeah. He could save anybody. No problem for God. But you see, here's the bottom line for you, for me, for everybody on this planet. When it comes to looking at God, looking at the gospel, no matter who we are, God is going to give us what we really want. Always. If you and I want Jesus, if we want God, He will run. The story of the prodigal is, He'll run to meet us. But if we don't, He'll give us that too. He's not going to make us believe anything. I don't know where everybody is today, but if I've said anything about which you've got a question, you want to pray with me, speak with me after the service about anything I've said or anything we've done today, I'll be glad to stay here as long as it